Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Autumn Hume. I am a communications officer with the City of Kingston. I'll be facilitating tonight's event. So we're going to get underway with this development charges open house. Just seeing the number of people in the event. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know sort of what your focus is for this evening, we'd be more than happy to adjust the presentation a little bit to, if you're a developer, if you're a member of the public here for some general interest. Otherwise, we'll proceed. So just some housekeeping items to start us off this evening. The session is live streamed and recorded. Video and microphones by default are turned off for participants. This is as a privacy measure. Some basic technology troubleshooting. So at times you may have trouble with Zoom's features. Please feel free to adjust the view options to make sure that you can see the presentation, any of the speakers. If you have any tech challenges, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll try to address the ones that we can. We'll be sharing this live on YouTube, and the recording will be posted to the project's Get Involved page. So if you do drop off and you're having trouble rejoining, the simplest thing might be to just join the YouTube watch and go from there. So this presentation does feature a question and answer period towards the end. We'll ask that you submit questions using the Q&A tool. It's just located at the bottom. You'll see the little highlighted question and answer button. Just feel free to drop any questions you have in there, and we will be able to address those questions as they come in sort of towards the end. If you'd like to ask a question verbally, when we get to the Q&A portion, use the raise hand feature to let us know. We'll unmute you and you'll be able to ask your question verbally, and we'll get you an answer. So just a quick moment here with our housekeeping out of the way. I want to acknowledge that the City of Kingston is located on the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and we thank these people for their care and stewardship over the land. Reconciliation is an ongoing process the city is committed to. Up on your screen, you'll see now the guidelines for participation. So these are the guidelines laid out in the city's public engagement framework to ensure that everybody has an opportunity to contribute and participate in public engagement discussions. So just leave these up here for a moment. If there's any concerns, please feel free to drop a note in the chat, but otherwise these will be sort of just established baseline operating. And getting into the agenda for this evening. So there'll be a quick introduction from Desiree Kennedy, the CFO and City Treasurer, followed by a presentation from Nancy Neal at Watson Associates Economics, or Economists, sorry. And then we'll go from that into the question and answer period. Without too much further ado, then I will turn this over to Desiree. And Nancy, I'll be advancing slides throughout this presentation. So if you want me to move forward or move back, just let me know.
Okay, great. Thanks, Autumn. And welcome. We have a very small group by the looks of it. So nice intimate size group. We can have some good discussion on this. So thanks for those that have joined. I think Nancy's going to be walking us through a presentation tonight. So it's nice to have some folks other than us here that she can talk to, because we are going to be taping this, as Autumn said, for others to be able to watch. So it'll be a great resource for others and that might be interested in all things development charges. So thanks for being here tonight. Before I turn it over to Nancy, so just a bit of a brief overview, and for those that maybe aren't as familiar with development charges. So the city does currently have a development charge regime where we do charge for new development. So that could be building new homes, new apartment buildings. There is a charge that goes against that, and that charge is used by the city to pay for growth. So as we have increased development and say a bunch of new houses or a new subdivision. As people come into our community, that means we require more in terms of services. So we may have a need for more roads. We've got more cars on the roads. It may be a need for additional recreational facilities or libraries, increased use of transit. And so those things, those growth related costs can be funded by development charges. If they are not covered by development charges, then those costs of growth are falling back to the existing taxpayers or ratepayers in the case of water and wastewater. And so the whole principle behind the development charges regime is that growth is paying for growth as opposed to coming back on existing tax and ratepayers. We have been working on this background study and bylaw, which are now posted publicly for review, and will be addressed at a public meeting early in February. We've been working both city staff as well as a group from the development community through a number of exercises to pull this information together. And we've also been working very closely with Watson and Associates, and in particular with Nancy Neal has been guiding us through this process. So tonight, Nancy is going to just sort of walk us through more general concepts of development charges and what they are. And we'll touch just briefly on some of where we are within the information that's within the draft background study that's available on the Get Involved Kingston page. I'm sure you've been on that page in terms of getting the link to this, but there's certainly some good information there as well. And you can direct others that may have questions on development charges in general or questions in particular to this study. There's lots of information on that Get Involved Kingston page. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to Nancy from Watson's and have her walk us through the presentation tonight.
Thanks, Ez, and good evening, everyone. If Autumn, can you forward to the next slide? And I'll just, going forward, just say next slide. So as Des has mentioned, really the purpose of today is to present the findings of the background study and all of the work that's gone into it over most of last year. That found its way into a development charge background study that was released on December 17th. That release date was to meet legislative requirements that we have to follow as per the Development Charges Act prior to council being able to consider a new bylaw. So there is minimum requirements for that background study to be prepared and available to the public. We have that includes providing it at least 2 weeks prior to a formal public meeting taking place. And you'll see the timing of when that is coming up in a future slide. And also meeting a timeline to ensure that the background study is available for a minimum of 60 days before council considers passing a new bylaw. So all of those dates that we have included, we are in compliance with the requirements of the Development Charges Act. And really, we have throughout the process last year met with the development community on a number of occasions. And really tonight and that future public meeting is to provide everyone across the city, both the public and the development community or anyone working in it, with an overview of the findings of the studies. But there is a lot of particulars, if you are interested in more details, that you would want to go to the actual study and look into further. Next slide. So just to give you an overview, sorry, next slide, of the purpose of development charges, as Des mentioned, it does help to provide infrastructure or a revenue source for additional infrastructure. So the Development Charges Act does allow municipalities to pass a bylaw to recover the capital costs associated with residential and non-residential development within a municipality. So this is not ongoing operating costs. Once an asset is put in place, property taxes or water wastewater rates would help to, would be the funding source to pay for those day-to-day operating costs, maintenance costs, and eventual replacement of assets or major maintenance that has to happen over time. So this is a one-time initial capital charge that's put in place for the incremental costs associated with growth. The development charge background study and the draft bylaw does follow an established practice that has been here in Ontario since 1989, where to the extent allowable under the Development Charges Act, municipalities can recover as much growth related costs as possible from that growth so that it doesn't then burden the existing taxpayers or ratepayers to pay for additional infrastructure that really is needed to service growth. And without that growth, those additional assets and infrastructure would not be required. So the costs that we put into the development charge calculations are costs that have a broad benefit. And if you think about a local subdivision that's being built, there are some services within that we call local services that a developer would pay as part of doing that or developing that subdivision. Those includes things such as the internal roads and sidewalks, street lights, small parkettes, or providing some base development to a piece of land that's going to be dedicated for a park, and stormwater management facilities. Those are still the requirement of the developer to do at 100% their cost. The costs that we put into the development charges are typically costs that provide a benefit, not just to one specific development, but to multiple developments or development as a whole throughout the city as it's happening in different areas. Increases to the transportation network and the major roads that connect all the different smaller communities, for example, those increased transit costs and other things that we'll get into as well. Next slide. So there has been a long history now in Ontario with the Development Charges Act. The first act was actually put in place in 1989. Prior to that, municipalities could collect capital costs for additional infrastructure through the Planning Act. They used to be called lot levies. However, there was back in the mid-50s to 1989, a lot of different rules that municipalities were put in place through that regime. And so the province got together and came up with the Development Charges Act to help guide municipalities in a specific methodology to follow to recover these capital costs going forward. That first act really allowed municipalities to collect up to 100% of all their growth-related needs for any service that they provided. In 1997, there was a major overhaul to the Act, and it introduced mandatory reductions, mandatory exemptions, and other rules that took municipalities from being able to recover 100% of their costs down to somewhere between 75 and 85% on average, depending on what your growth needs were and the services each municipality was collecting for. Since that time, and especially over the last few years, there has been 10 additional changes to the legislation, most of which has further reduced what municipalities can recover from growth directly. So with all of the changes and the reductions and exemptions that we'll get into, this has resulted in the existing taxpayers and water wastewater ratepayers still having to help fund some of the growth-related infrastructure that's required to service the new growth. Next slide. Those various different pieces of legislation on the previous slide where I was talking about specific bill numbers, we have here the full names of those in case anyone wants to go on, on Google and start exploring any of the particulars within any of those changes. The full name and year that they were put in place is here for information purposes. Next slide. So there have been a number of notable changes that have taken place since the city put their last development charge bylaw in place. There is a calculation that we have to do for many of the services that looks back over a historic period of time. It used to be 10 years, it's been now extended to 15 years, where the Development Charges Act says that you cannot charge future growth anything more than what you've provided to your existing community on average over the last 15 years. Prior study, it was over 10 years. So that is a change that has been embraced in this new study. There's been a change in the time that you collect development charges. So for the most part, development charges are collected at the time of the first building permit issuance. But for rental, housing, and any type of institutional development going forward, they now pay their development charges in 6 equal annual payments, with the first payment commencing at the time of occupancy permit, not building permit. And then every year for the next 5 years on the anniversary date of that occupancy permit is when the city will collect the next installment for those types of developments. That really allows those types of developments to have a longer period of time with rental residential homes. Of course, it's not like a condo where you're selling the units up front. So it takes a little longer to occupy those units and start getting some of the revenues. And this has helped to then mitigate some of those upfront costs that developers in the rental housing market have. So that's what was introduced. There's also a difference now for developments that are proceeding through site plan or a zoning bylaw amendment planning approval process. If an application was received on or after January 1st, 2020, and received approval before or as of June 5th of 2024, the rate that they pay for the development charges is frozen at the date they applied for that application. And from the date they received the approval, they have 2 years to get their building permit issued, and they still pay the rate that was in effect at the date of the application. Similarly, if any of those site plan or zoning bylaw amendment applications did not receive approval by June 5th, 2024, but have received approval as of June 6th, 2024 or going forward, that 2-year window between approval and building permit application has been reduced to 18 months, but it's still frozen at the date the application came in. Now, for the institutional rental housing installment payments, as well as for the site plan or zoning bylaw rate freezes, the city can impose a maximum interest rate on those to help to recover some of the costs that they would otherwise be able to have upfront. They may have to issue debt to undertake some of the costs and projects because they won't have the money up front. And so that helps to mitigate some of the lost revenue that they would receive up front and be able to invest otherwise. There's also a modernization for a lot of municipalities throughout the province that no longer have newspapers. The requirements to provide public notices of public meetings and bylaw passages has been changed so that those municipalities can post those notices directly on their website to meet the legislative requirements. However, municipalities that still have newspapers are still required to also post those notices in the newspapers. Next slide. There was also a lot of additional exemptions for certain types of developments that have been introduced in the last few years. So for existing or new developments, at the time of application for permits, you can now add up to 2 additional residential units to a single-family, semi-detached, or townhouse unit, as long as the zoning allows for it. So you can have 3 units as of right. And those additional 2 units, the city can no longer recover a development charge for them. Even though additional people will be going into those units, they are fully exempt under the legislation. There's also now statutory exemptions for affordable residential units and attainable residential units. Those became effective June 1st, 2024. There's also now a statutory full exemption for nonprofit housing and for municipalities with inclusionary zoning bylaws that define affordable housing units differently than maybe the affordable units under the Development Charges Act is defined. They would also be fully exempt. There's also a statutory exemption for any universities or any campuses, small or large, that would be receiving ongoing funding from the province. If, for example, Queen's University wanted to do an expansion or build a new building, they would not have to pay the non-residential development charges. For rental housing, there is a discount. Now, rental housing for this discount purpose is based on a definition that there are 4 or more residential units, all of which are for rental purposes. If that test is met, then depending on the number of bedrooms in each of the units, they get a discount off of the rate that's in place. With units that have 3 or more bedrooms getting a 25% reduction off the charge, 2-bedroom units getting a 20% reduction, and 1-bedroom or bachelor units getting a 15% reduction. In the past, there used to be a stipulation that a bylaw could not be in place for more than 5 years. That has now been extended. So this next bylaw could be in place for up to a maximum of 10 years. Now, that's not to say that if there's a major change that the city becomes aware of that requires an update, that they couldn't do that within that 10-year window. But it does allow municipalities to keep a bylaw in place longer if it is still all applicable. There's also now a requirement to allocate funds annually for any municipalities collecting water or wastewater services or services related to a highway, which is all the roads and related infrastructure, where they now have to ensure that they are spending or allocating 60% of the opening development charge reserve fund each year to ensure that projects are moving forward. Those are really the essential projects that are necessary for developments to happen and for building permits to be issued. And then there are additional annual requirements of the treasurer's statements on the DC reserve funds, including posting it on the municipal website and keeping each of those there for the entire term of a bylaw. So if a bylaw lasts 10 years, eventually you will see on the city's website 10 different annual statements related to the reserve funds, with the ins and outs of them, what's been collected, any interest earning, and what's been spent out of them, including opening and closing balances. Next slide. So the Development Charges Act provides specific services that if municipalities provide those services, they can collect for. The ones that are highlighted in various colors here are the ones that we have reviewed and included in the Development Charges background study. The water, wastewater services related to a highway, transit, waste diversion, policing, fire, library, and parks and rec services are services that the city is already collecting for under their current development charge bylaw. Additional services that have been added this time around for the 2024 DC study that'll be put in place include stormwater drainage, ambulance services, and Provincial Offences Act, which also includes bylaw enforcement. We also looked at long-term care, and we undertook some of the calculations to determine how much the city could include. However, at the time we were undertaking the study, there was further review and study needed to determine what the capital needs are to expand. So at this point, there hasn't been anything included in the calculated charges for long-term care, but that is something that the city may, in the years following, update the study or include in a future DC study once that has been identified if there's growth-related needs for that service. Next slide. And again. So one of the things we have to do as almost one of our first steps is identify the amount, type, and location of the growth that is anticipated, both residential and non-residential. On the residential side of things, we look at population and housing. So the net population increase that we looked at for the 10-year forecast included just under 22,600 people. For some of the services, we actually have capital needs identified right out to 2051. So when we extend that forecast out to 2051, by then we're looking at just under 56,400 people to be added to the city. And then for the water and wastewater services, not all properties get those services. There is a current urban boundary. And so we have looked at how much population could be embraced in that current urban boundary for those two services. And that kind of urban build out or urban boundary build out produces just over 40,000 additional people. Now, over these forecast periods, the type of units or housing units that those people would be living in varies. There are low density units, which are your single and semi-detached homes. There's medium density units that are things such as townhouses or row houses. High density buildings are your apartment buildings. There's also institutional residential units, which are things such as long-term care homes. They could be group homes, hospices, retirement homes, and the such. And then, of course, you also have quite a bit of off-campus student housing needs, and we are anticipating growth in that sector as well over each of the forecast periods. So in total, in the next 10 years, those 22,600 people almost will be looking at adding approximately 10,900 additional residential units throughout the city for new units. Going out to 2051, that really grows to over 27,200 additional units. And in that current urban boundary for water and wastewater services, it's 20,680 units is the total number of new units. Next slide. On the non-residential side of things, we look at four main sectors that produce additional square footage when buildings are constructed to house new employees. The primary sector is really in the rural sector and agricultural area. There is about 56 additional employees that we feel will be housed in about 168,000 square feet of new building space in the 10 years. And that grows to 78 additional employees and 234,000 square feet of space. Of course, for the water wastewater services, these are outside the urban boundary, so those types of developments would not be paying the water and wastewater components of the DC. All of the other sectors, industrial, commercial, and institutional, are anticipated to grow as well pretty significantly. Within the 10 years, we're looking at a total non-residential growth of employees of just under 11,900, and they will be housed in almost 10.6 million square feet of building spaces. That extended out over the 27-year period to 2051, grows to almost 26,000 employees housed in 22.8 million square feet. And of course, in that urban boundary, some of those developments will take place with 17,620 employees housed in 14,000 square feet of new building spaces. These numbers, both the residential and non-residential, really play into the denominator of our calculations for the development charge rates that are produced, with the costs needed for infrastructure being the numerator in our calculation and the growth being the denominator in our calculation. Next slide. So there is, what the city has been seeing is actually an incline in existing households in recent years. Therefore, we have looked at that, and we believe that trend will still happen. So a lot of that is because of multi-generational families. Young people aren't moving out as soon as they used to. Some, for different varying reasons. With immigration, there's more multi-generational homes quite often. With a shortage of long-term care homes and beds for ailing elderly people. They are moving in with their adult kids quite often. And so we are predicting that in the existing households, there will still be somewhat of an incline. So some of the new population will actually not be in new residential units, but will be in the existing units. And therefore, we've made some adjustments to recognize that some of the additional infrastructure that has to be put in place will be put in place to serve those people as well. However, we can't collect a development charge from an existing home. So we have made deductions, and those costs will have to be borne by the taxpayers and ratepayers for their proportionate share of the costs. With the forecast periods, as noted in the growth forecast there were quite a few of the services that we looked at only over a 10-year forecast period, including fire, policing, parks and rec, library transit, waste diversion, ambulance, and the Provincial Offences Act, including bylaw enforcement. Those charges will be applied citywide to any growth that comes, but we've only looked at what the next 10 years worth of needs are. For the services related to a highway, we've gone right out to 2051 because we have master plans that have helped to provide us with what the needs are for that longer period of time. And of course, the water, wastewater, and stormwater are limited to just that current urban boundary build out. Next slide. So one of the things we do have to undertake, as mentioned, is these historical service standard calculations. And so for all services except water, wastewater, stormwater, and transit, we have to undertake these calculations. Why we do not have to undertake them for water, wastewater, and stormwater is because there's other legislation in place in Ontario that overrides the development charge legislation that dictates how municipalities have to put those services in place and the standard to which they have to construct any of those services. However, for transit, it's actually now a forward-looking forecast based on ridership projections and the number of trips that are anticipated or mode share that transit will take of all the trips that happen within the city. But for all the other services, we have to look at this historical standard, and we have to assess both quantity and quality measures. So quantities might be the number of kilometers of roads, or the square footage of facility spaces, the number of vehicles and equipment that are in place, the acreage of development in parks, etc. And then our quality measure is current replacement values. And what this does when we undertake these calculations is sets an upper limit of what we could include if we have growth-related infrastructure needs to include in the calculations. You will see here that, for example, the services related to a highway, the historical service standard would allow the city to collect and include in the calculations of the DCs upwards of $964 million almost. However, what you can see is what we have included is just over $199.88 million in the calculations. So really there's $764 million and change that is not going into the calculations. As you go down the table there for the various different services, you can see that for the most part, we have not included everything in the calculations that could have been included there. Next page. And the next page really continues to provide what the city could include. You'll see for long-term care, for example, we calculated that historical service standard. It would have allowed if there was growth-related needs, up to 28.2 million and change to be included in the development charge calculations. At this time, we haven't included anything because there's that further study going on. Where if you look at the ambulance, we have pretty much maxed out what the city can recover. So in some cases, there may be in some municipalities more infrastructure needs than what their historical service standard maximum ceilings would allow. And that doesn't mean that it's not growth related. It just means that the municipality can't collect for it through development charges. And those types of costs would have to look for other funding measures as well. So in total, there's over $1.17 billion that could have been included in these calculations for these services. 299 million was included in the calculations, leaving over 876 million that could still be included if additional works at some point in the future are identified as a need for growth. Next slide. So the development charge capital needs for that incremental need for growth is something we went through in very much detail, working with all of the staff in the various different departments at the city, as well as Utilities Kingston. And what was identified over the various periods was just over $1.37 million worth of total gross related costs. Now, some of those costs we understand are not all for growth, and certainly not all for growth necessarily in the period that we were looking at. So, for example, on fire, there was $45.96 million identified that were needed, but some of those were for facilities that are being oversized when they're being built, understanding that outside of the first 10 years, there's still more growth to come. Those are what we have deducted as a post-period benefit charge of about 46.17 million in total. Again, there's still growth-related costs, but they will be added into future development charge calculations when more growth comes into the calculations for those services. There's also some other deductions that have been made in various areas. Some of those deductions are things such as with fire and ambulance, for example. There's a portion that the county is responsible for the ambulance, so we've deducted that. For waste diversion, some of the projects will benefit both waste diversion and landfill. However, landfill is ineligible to be recovered through development charges. So another 29.26 million in change has been deducted from the calculations. Oh, if you can go back one more. There we go. And then you'll see that over $493 million has been deducted as a benefit to existing. So a lot of the projects are not just brand new. They may be that something is being replaced and expanded. Well, the replacement component of a project is really there for the existing community already, and the city would have to eventually replace that as part of their life cycle or asset management. So those components we've deducted. So we're really still only looking at that incremental cost that is needed to service growth for upgrades or expanded infrastructure to service the growth. So we've deducted that. And then there are some grants, subsidies, and other contributions that are anticipated on a number of projects that we won't have to recover from growth. That's another $78.5 million almost. So of that gross capital cost of over $1.37 million, what we've embraced in the calculations for the development charges is about 53% of that, or 731,000 or almost 731.2 million. We then also look at the costs for the different services and how much of those will benefit what we're anticipating on the residential growth side of things versus the non-residential growth side of things. So almost $450 million of the 731 is allocated to residential growth benefit, and the balance of just over 281 million is to the benefit of non-residential growth. Next slide. Of course, the development charge study gives you a lot more detail of what every one of those projects are that make up those high-level numbers if you're interested and want to go and look for it. The calculated rates is what this slide provides. So as mentioned, we look at different residential unit types. Single and semi-detached homes tend to have higher average persons per unit in it than something like a townhouse that's a multiple or row house or an apartment. So we first calculate the rates based on a per capita basis, and then we multiply that by the average persons per unit in the various types of residential units to generate the charges. Those urban services that you see, if we focus on the single and semi-detached homes, the water, wastewater, stormwater components of $16,965 would not be recovered from any new homes that are being built in the rural areas where they don't receive those services and they're on a well or septic tank. They would only be paying the municipal-wide charges of the $19,559 for all of the other services they would benefit from. But in total, if you are in the urban serviced area, the calculated charge is $36,524. And then as the units get smaller, so does the charge, right down to that special care special dwelling unit, which is that institutional type unit, long-term care homes, hospices, group homes, etc., being at, in the urban area, $14,227. On the non-residential side of things, it is differentiated with a rate per square foot for industrial developments. In the urban area, that would be $9.09 per square foot. And then for non-industrial, which is your commercial and institutional and primary, in the urban area, it would be $27.68. The primary that is outside the urban area would just pay the municipal charge of $7.63 per square foot. Next slide. As a high-level comparison on where the current rates are to where these new calculated rates are on a single detached home, if we look at the urban area, going from $31,026, which is being recovered today, to $36,524 once the new bylaw is in place. It's about an overall 17.7% increase for those homes. Next slide. Similarly, for a one-bedroom or bachelor apartment, we've shown you what the increase would be. It is a larger increase on these type of units, and that's because we're seeing more average or higher average persons per unit in these units than what used to be there during the last development charge calculation. So just under a 33% increase, going from the $12,610 to just over $16,700 per unit for those. Next slide. And for the apartments that are 2 bedrooms or more, again, almost a 20% increase on the charge, going from $20,611 per unit currently up to almost $24,700 per unit. Next slide. On the non-residential side, depending on whether you're industrial or non-industrial, again, for the industrial, we're actually seeing a decrease in the charge from the current rate of $11.90 per square foot down to that $9.09 per square foot. So decrease of almost 24% in that rate in the urban area. And then for the non-industrial, about a 10% increase in the charge from the $25.07 per square foot to the $27.68 per square foot. Next slide. This next slide really shows where the current rates versus the calculated rates are for the city in comparison to municipalities of similar size or in the area um, to Kingston. So you can see right now the yellow line for a single detached unit is where the current rate is. We have included in here both lower tier and single tier charges as well as upper tier charges because some municipalities are in a two-tiered system. And we have separated out the water and wastewater charges as well because in some situations, the lower tier collects for that or single tier municipality, where in other jurisdictions, the upper tier recovers for the water wastewater services, or there may be a shared service with an upper tier collecting for things such as treatment and storage, where the lower tier is providing the actual distribution or collection systems. We've also included in there the education development charges where they exist for these municipalities so that you really see a total all-in charge when you come to the counter to pull a building permit. So really, right now, Kingston, with the comparators, is fairly low on the list, and we're not seeing a big change on where you are compared to all of the other municipalities here. Now, we do want to note that there are some municipalities that are still undergoing their DC studies, and there may be further updates and changes to some of their numbers in the months to come. Next slide. Similarly, for a one-bedroom or bachelor apartment, again, we've provided with the yellow line where the current rates are, and just slightly above in that blue line is where the calculated rates would take you. So total all in with education of $13,576, moving up to the $17,688 per unit. Next slide. And similarly for the two-bedroom apartments, again, still fairly low compared to all of the comparators and moving up slightly from that yellow line to the blue line. Next slide. For the industrial, as noted, the yellow line is the current rate, and as noted, we would actually be reducing that rate with the new bylaw from the $11.90 per square foot down to that $9.09. And next slide. For the non-industrial, again, slight increase over where the current rates are, but still really staying around the same area that you're currently at for the comparators. Next slide. So there are a number of changes in what you will see in the draft bylaw that has been put forward. As noted, all of those new mandatory or statutory rules that have been put in place for exemptions, discounts, rate freezes, etc., is summarized there on the left-hand side. There are still others that have been in place for many years in the Development Charges Act that are embraced in the bylaw, including a one-time industrial expansion up to 50% of the existing square footage of the building. So if I have a 5,000 square foot building now, I could expand it by 2,500 square feet and I wouldn't pay a development charge. Any square feet footage over 2,500 that I expand by, I would start paying the industrial rate on. There's also residential intensification exemptions that have been there for years, where if I just expand my home, I'm not charged anything on development charges. And then municipalities, counties, and school boards, if they are building any buildings in the city, don't charge each other their development charges. So if the county was building an ambulance facility, the city would not impose their DC on them. If there was one of the public or separate school boards were building new schools, the city would not impose the DCs on them. And then, of course, as the city builds new facilities for all of the different services, the county and school boards would not impose their charges on the city either. That has been around since pretty much the beginning of the Development Charges Act. Everything else there on the left we've talked about. Now, what makes every bylaw throughout the province unique is that every council can choose to further exempt or discount certain types or classes of developments. Right now, and currently, as well as in the future proposed bylaw, industrial development is actually 100% exempt at the moment, unless council changes their mind before they pass the bylaw. In the draft bylaw, we're continuing to exempt those fully. However, we are looking at defining that as to who would get 100% exemption so that it's a little bit more clear. So the North American Industry Classification System is something we use to generate our growth forecast. And there's certain codes or specific areas for the industrial sector, and they are codes 31 to 33 that will receive that 100% exemption going forward. So just a little bit more refinement to make it clear as to who will get those full exemptions versus who won't. There's also a full exemption for motion picture and video production developments in the city that will continue moving forward. And then there are some lands designated as part of a community improvement area that may be exempt, depending on the rules and the agreements that have been entered into with the city in the past. The portion of a place of worship that is for worship is 100% exempt, as well as any buildings or structures in a cemetery or burial ground. Agricultural uses are 100% exempt, with some exclusions that are laid out in the bylaw. And then seasonal air-supported structures, save and except any portion that is permanent, but does not include things like washrooms, change rooms, canteens, and concession stands, are 100% exempt. Seasonal buildings or structures under certain rules are 100% exempt. Temporary venues and temporary buildings or structures are still all in the bylaw to be fully exempt. Now, with both statutory and non-statutory discounts or exemptions, all of these rules, if these types of developments come forward, will result in the city not being able to recover the full costs of growth through development charges. And those costs then fall to, for the most part, property taxes or water wastewater rates, unless the city is successful in gaining additional grant funding or subsidy funding or any other type of external funding to help fund those. So this is where the existing community still does help to pay for the additional infrastructure that is needed to support growth. Next slide. And next slide. So the next steps really is we are still looking at potential refinement to a few of the projects where we have received updated information on it. So before January 31st, there may be a minor amendment to the development charge report that was put out. We are anticipating any of these changes would potentially provide a reduction in the calculated rates, not an increase to them. But that may be released before the end of the month if it's determined that with the new information we've received since we released the report, that a change is necessary. That formal public meeting that's required under the Development Charges Act is scheduled for February 4th. And then council is going to be considering the bylaw at their meeting of February 18th. And it's anticipated right now that the effective date of the new bylaw will be upon approval on February 18th. Next slide. So that is really the end of my presentation. Hopefully that has provided everyone online with an overview of the findings of the background study. Again, we'd be happy to answer any questions, and we would, point you towards that full study if you are interested in learning more about the details of projects that are anticipated to go forward. Autumn, I'll hand it back over to you for now.
Thank you. So I've shared the link to the project in the chat there. We've got all the documents up there as well as contact information. This video will also be available on that webpage shortly. So if you want to go back and reference any portions of this, you're free to do so. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A portion right now. So just a reminder, if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them in there and we'll answer them. If you would prefer to ask your question verbally, just hit the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen there and I'll unmute you. Otherwise, I'll give it a moment or two to see if we have any questions roll in.
So Autumn, maybe
Mhm.
while folks are thinking about whether they've got any questions, Nancy, just sort of based on a couple folks I see are on the line, can you maybe explain, you were talking about with the DC rate comparisons that why the one bedroom bachelor apartments were going up so much more, I think like 32% because of the number of people. I think you said number of people within the unit, but yet the 2+ bedrooms was not going up as much. And then I think similarly, why are we seeing such a decrease in the industrial?
Sure. So, there's a lot that goes on in the calculations behind all of this. Once we have assigned the growth to the residential sector, as noted, we take those total costs that will benefit the residential development and we divide that into the total population that's anticipated to take place. That gives us a cost per capita. We then apply that cost per capita to the various different unit types based on the average persons per unit. What we have seen is a change in that over time, especially since COVID took place, where there are more people now in smaller type units, where we used to see, just over, 1 to 1.5 people potentially in a small 1-bedroom or bachelor apartment. We're seeing higher numbers in there. And so with more people going into smaller units, their proportionate share of costs for the services that are being provided to them results in a higher charge. Where other units are staying, like the 2-bedroom units, are staying more stable with what we saw in the past with those average persons per unit. They haven't increased as significantly proportionately as the small units have. So hopefully that it's very mathematical, but hopefully that helps it. On the non-residential side of things, again, once we've assigned the total cost for non-residential, we look at the growth in the different sectors and how much land there is for industrial growth versus commercial and institutional growth, for example, helps us divide the costs in the numerator of our calculation that is for those different sectors. And then again, we look at the average floor space per worker in those sectors. And typically in the industrial sector, what we're seeing across the province and especially in the city is higher average floor space for every worker that are in those buildings. So if you think of some of these big logistic warehouses, there's tons of space, but not a lot of employees. So the increase in the average floor space per worker has generated a higher amount of growth that we're anticipating for total new square footage in those industrial buildings. And that becomes our denominator for the calculation, which is actually driving down the rate per square foot. Versus the commercial and institutional sectors are fairly stable with what's been there in the past. So that's, again, there's a few different things that mathematically go into those calculations that result in those charges, but that's for the most part what is driving those charges to change.
We have a comment in the chat saying dens 7 square meter are in general being considered bedrooms. The developer I represent would like a review of this policy.
And maybe Des, you could chat about that, but there are in some units, regardless of the number of bedrooms, developments happening with dens these days that can easily be converted if they're a certain size into a bedroom. They may not have a formal constructed closet, but with wardrobes and dressers, they could easily be added to a den with a bed put in it. And so over a certain size of a room, the municipality can consider that a bedroom for determining how, much we actually will impose a charge on. Are there any other questions?
Not seeing any other questions at this time. I'll just give it a moment. And then,
So I can just maybe add on them that there is there's contact information and a spot
Okay.
to leave comments on the Get Involved Kingston page as well. So if anybody has any questions, they can reach out, or any comments they want to make, they can do that on the Get Involved Kingston page. We monitor that as well.
yes, and there's details there about the public meeting in February. Okay. Seeing no more questions or comments, I'm gonna wrap this event up. I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening and taking part. Have a pleasant night. Bye.
Thanks, Autumn.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Nancy.
You're welcome.